us. That is not me by any means, but it's a terrific program that the who are they? I want to be sure I call them right. General Commission on Religion and Race have set out lots of other options, much like this one. The speaker for the video, which we pray will work. I've downloaded it 12 times. I've tried it 100 different times. Of course, it won't work for us today, but is Robin DiAngelo. I've gotten kind of obsessed with her. I've watched a lot of her videos on YouTube. If you see this video and you have an interest, I highly recommend checking her out. Her book is called White Fragility. And I meant to double check my dates for this video, but I think this video came out before her book, which has been on the New York bestseller list, I think, for about over 90 weeks at this point. So she's quite an expert. She teaches at the University of Washington. Lots of great videos on the internet where she speaks. She's a very dynamic speaker too, guys. So if you have an interest and you haven't seen some of her stuff, excellent. I will also admit, and I bet several of you have read the book White Fragility. I have not. I have been on hold for it at the library for something like 4 months. And the last time I checked, I had like 16 weeks at least left. So it's a very popular book, clearly in our community as well, which is an encouraging thought. Without further ado, I could go on forever. I will have an opening prayer, and then I'll do a little introduction of her bio, and I'll share her definition of racism, and then hopefully the video will work. So if you will join me in an opening prayer. And again, thanks for joining us. Dear Lord, we thank you so much for bringing us together to hear these important messages. Help us listen, learn, and understand your word for us today. These things we ask in your name. Amen. I will tell you that Beverly, why do I keep calling her? I'm trying to call her the lady from Christmas Vacation, Beverly DiAngelo. If I say that, keep saying that, please insert Robin, who would be perhaps an interesting speaker as well. But her first book was called What Does It Mean to Be White? Developing White Racial Literacy. She's been an anti-racist educator and has heard justifications of racism by white men and women in her workshops for over 2 decades. This justification, which she calls white fragility, is a state in which even a minimum amount of racial stress becomes intolerable, triggering a range of defensive moves. These moves include outward displays of emotion, such as anger, fear, and guilt, and behaviors such as argumentation, silence, and leaving stress-inducing situations. So that she teaches at the University of Washington. With all the turmoil of this summer, she's been on a lot of different news shows. There's a lot there to look up. Again, I'm her new favorite stalker on the internet. So without further ado, I'm going to read her definition of racism. It's a little bit long, but I think it's rather insightful for how she sees the world. And it's very small print, so I hope you'll indulge my poor eyes. She calls racism a system that encompasses economic, political, social, and cultural structures, actions, and beliefs that institutionalize and perpetuate an unequal distribution of privileges, resources, and power between white, capital white people, and people of color, capital C color. This system is historic, normalized, taken for granted, deeply embedded, and works to the benefit of whites and to the disadvantage of the people of color. So let us also now have a prayer that the video will play. And of course, where did the video go? Here it is. Hopefully this works, guys. Does it seem to be working?
I'm Dr. Robin DiAngelo, and my work focuses on the question of what does it mean to be white in a society that proclaims race meaningless, yet is profoundly separated by race. And to start this off, I want to draw your attention to the fact that I'm white. So just look at me for a moment, think about it, notice it. And part of being white is that is a very uncomfortable thing for me to do. And it's taken me many, many years to be able to draw people's attention to my race and see any significance in it. And that's because as a white person, I was socialized to see race as what they had. I was just a person. I was just a white bread, a Heinz 57. I didn't have race. I was socialized to see race as individual acts of discrimination and prejudice, individual acts that anybody could do to anybody else. And if you did those acts, you were a bad person. And that is why, since I saw myself as a good person, I didn't see myself as connected to racism, and certainly didn't see myself as connected to race. In other words, I didn't have a sense of a racial identity. Today, I understand that I move through the world always and most particularly as a white person. I have a white frame of reference and I have a white experience. And part of being white is to have that be invisible to us and to be able to live our lives without ever acknowledging that, to see that as non-operative. I now understand racism as a system, as a deeply embedded system, a system that our country was founded on, and that all our institutions were created out of. And every institution reinforces this system. And it's a system of unequal power. So let me give you an example. Women in the United States got the right to vote in 1920. And there was only one possible way that we could have gotten the right to vote, and that was for men to give it to us, because we literally were not sitting in the seats of institutional power. We could not give ourselves the right to vote. That doesn't mean that we couldn't have personal power, but we didn't have institutional power. And that's the difference between a system and individual acts. Prior to women's suffrage, I could certainly discriminate against men. I could be unfair to individual men, but my group could not systematically deny men as a group the right to vote. And men controlled all the institutions, and they all worked together to convey the message that women's place was here and men's place was there. And that's the difference between individual prejudice and a system of inequality. So in this field, we think about oppression, or in this case, racism, as group prejudice backed by institutional power. And so prior to the civil rights movement, it was fairly socially acceptable for white people to just come out and say, we are superior. But post-civil rights, it became bad to be racist, right? It became unacceptable to be racist. And that seems like a positive thing, right? Racism is bad. But unfortunately, what it morphed into is to make it impossible for white people to look at racism, because what we hear is, I would have to be a bad person in order to perpetuate racism. It became a moral issue. Yeah. In addition to years of reflection and study of my own racial identity and how it shapes my life and my experience and my perspectives, I've had the very rare opportunity to, for a living, day in and day out, lead primarily white groups of people in discussions of race and racism. And there are some very, very predictable patterns that come up in these conversations. And as I listen to these, it's almost like a script. And as I listen to white folks, my group, repeat these narratives over and over, I got this image of a dock, like a pier, and it's just floating on the water, and that's all the superficial things that we say. And you probably recognize some of these, you hear them, maybe you've said them yourself. I don't see color. I was taught to treat everybody the same. I don't care if you're pink, blue, purple, polka dotted. My parents weren't racist, that's why I'm not racist. Or my parents were racist, that's why I'm not racist. It doesn't really matter what goes in front of it. The answer is always, I'm not racist. I know people of color. I used to work in the military. All we say to rationalize that we ourselves are not complicit in this system. Now, I want to speak to two of these before I kind of take us below the surface of the dock. And one is this idea that our parents taught us to treat everyone the same. And I am just going to put it out there like this. No, they didn't. That is not humanly possible. Human beings are not objective. You cannot be taught to treat or to see everyone the same. And when you say that, you're indicating that you don't understand how socialization works, which is actually a positive thing in the sense that that can direct what you would need to focus on if you want to get deeper understanding. The other one I want to speak to is this common trope of, I don't care if you're pink, purple, polka dotted. If that's in your vocabulary, I would urge you to please drop it and never say it again. Although it isn't intentional, it's actually very demeaning. People don't come in those colors, and what it conveys is that you're not prepared to engage with authenticity. Okay? And that's why I have this image of a dot, right? That's very superficial surface. And for me, in trying to understand how all this works, what it means to be white, and live so separate by race, even though I was taught to see myself individually as open-minded and outside of all of this, I've had to go under the surface. And that's why I have this image here now of under the water. You see the pillars or posts that prop up the surface. Okay? So, for example, it's very common in discussions of race to have white people tell you about all the people of color in their lives, right? Oh, I have these coworkers, or my best friend, or my second cousin married a black man, or all of the ways that we want everyone to know that we have relationships with people of color, okay? And so we're giving you evidence. When someone tells you that, they're giving you evidence. And so what are they giving you evidence of? They're giving you evidence that because they love people of color, know and love people of color, they can't be racist, which means they see racism as conscious dislike or explicit bias or hatred, right? And they're communicating to you that they don't have conscious dislike or hatred, as evidenced by all of these people in their lives. And what we don't understand is the power of implicit bias. Most bias is unconscious. And that makes it very, very dangerous because it drives our behaviors, but we're not aware of it. Yes, it's wonderful to have people of color in your life if you're white. Many, many, many people, white people, don't have people of color in close relationships. But that doesn't mean your life is free of racism. That doesn't mean you don't have a white experience or a white perspective. And it also doesn't mean that racism will not surface in your relationships with people of color. So if we go underneath and we look at the pillars that are supporting that kind of superficial ways that we're taught to think about racism, we see individualism as a very powerful prop or support, this idea that each of us is unique and outside of socialization. We see universalism, which is kind of the opposite of individualism. Individualism says, why can't we all be different? And universalism says, why can't we all be the same? This is a very popular ideology in religious or faith communities. And I'm not arguing that on a deep spiritual level, we're not all universally the same, but we don't live, if you will, in the spiritual realm. We live in the physical realm. And here in the physical realm, we have to ask ourselves, how does it function to say we all bleed under the skin? Well, it functions to take race off the table, to take power off the table, to deny that we have fundamentally different experiences, because racism is real. And while race isn't real, in other words, at the biological level, there is no real, true race or racial difference as we're taught to understand it, these very superficial signifiers of racial difference that allow us to categorize people, these are very real in their consequences for people's lives. And this insistence that we're all one doesn't allow us to engage with that social reality. I try to help white people see how race functions in our lives. And I try to move us away from the really obvious, evident examples, such as a racist joke or a racist action, or things that would be recognizable to everybody, right? The kinds of acts that cause people like me, well-meaning people like me, to say, I couldn't possibly be racist, I don't do those things. And I try to help white people understand racism as the very fabric of our society. Many people can recognize the explicit kind of conscious dislike type of racism, racist jokes, racist expressions, the KKK. But I want to help white people see the everyday racism that's embedded and that we participate in. And I want to look at neighborhood and school segregation as an example. I'm going to start with this app here. These are the app's founders. It's a new app called The Sketch Factor. And what it does is when you go to a new city, you can put in where you are, and it tells you which neighborhoods to avoid because they're sketchy. And of course, sketchy is very much associated with race and class in the white line. And so now we have the convenience of segregation through an app. We don't actually have to talk to other white people about, where are the good neighborhoods and the bad neighborhoods. And that good neighborhood, bad neighborhood, good schools, bad schools discourse is an example of new racism. I don't think it gets by anybody that is racially coded language. So this way we can come out and police those racial boundaries without ever kind of naming race. But we all know what we're talking about. And I think the most profound way that my life has been shaped by my race is through the power of segregation. Most white people do live in segregation. We choose that segregation. And in a lot of ways, we celebrate it. What makes a school good and what makes a neighborhood good? Well, the absence of people of color. That is the way that white people measure the value of their neighborhoods and schools. And while we don't come out and name that, we all know what it is. And so I have had to think very deeply on what it means to have grown up in a primarily white neighborhood, to be born into, to go to school, to study, to learn, to play, to worship, to love, to work, and to die in segregation, and not have one single person who loved, mentored, or guided me convey that there was any loss. And I'm going to repeat that because I think it's very profound, and I really want us to sit with it. That I can live my whole life in segregation. In fact, if I follow the trajectory that my loving parents laid out for me in my good neighborhood and my good school and my good college and my good career, in which I would ideally rise to the top, I could easily never have any consistent, ongoing, authentic relationships with people of color, and not one person who guided me ever conveyed that there was loss. Just sit with that for a moment, that there is no inherent value in the perspectives or experiences of people of color. If my parents, if my schools, if my curriculum, if my teachers, if my government saw value in those perspectives, I would be given those perspectives, but I wasn't given those perspectives. And that shapes my relationships. It shapes what I care about. It shapes what I see, what I don't see, who I build my life with, and who I don't build my life with. And that is the level where we really need to look at race inside of us and with us. In the line of work that I do, it's a breakthrough if you can get white people to acknowledge that our race privileges us in this society, right? That is like the second coming. Get white folks to admit that we are privileged by our race. But even that begins to get superficial. And you'll hear white people say, just because of the color of my skin, I have these things, as if this is just an accident that happens. And I want to take us deeper. I want to take us inside this skin. My psychosocial development was inculcated in the water of white supremacy. That is what I call this system. I don't mean the KKK. I mean a system in which whiteness and white people are central and seen as inherently superior to people of color. My personality was formed in that water. My worldview was formed in that water. I didn't choose it. It isn't my fault. I'm not racked with guilt about it, but I am responsible for changing it, because the default of our society is the reproduction of racism. It's built into every system and every institution. And if we just live our lives and carry on in the most comfortable ways for us, we will necessarily reproduce it. There is no neutral space. Inaction is a form of action. One of the most effective adaptations of racism since the civil rights era is this idea of a racist is a bad person, and if you're not racist, you're a good person. What I call the good-bad binary. And we can all fill it in, right? So if you're racist, then you're prejudiced and mean-spirited and bigoted, ignorant and Southern, and probably drive a pickup truck. So we got some classism in there, right? This is our racist. And if you're not racist, you're good and you're progressive and you're open-minded and you're educated and you're Northern. And this binary is probably the #1 construct that keeps racism today in place and makes it nearly impossible to talk to white people about racism. The defensiveness we have comes from this binary. What we hear is, you just said I was a bad person. And so this binary sets it up to be mutually exclusive. You cannot be a good person and be complicit with racism. So you'll notice in the news when racism gets talked about, they'll bring in the evidence they'll have to defend the person that's being accused of racism is, but he's a really nice person, right? Because again, it's mutually exclusive. We have to understand racism as a system that we're all a part of. You know, I often in my trainings, after I've laid out how racism works, I'll ask people of color, how often have you given white people feedback on our inevitable, unaware and unintentional, but inevitable racism, and have that go well for you? And, you know, there's eye rolls and laughter, and basically the answer is never. Okay? It's virtually impossible for people of color to give us feedback because that binary sets us up to defend, right? I must, at all costs, deflect and establish that I am not racist, right? And that makes it so that we can't examine the reality of the society that we live in. And then I'll follow up and ask this question. So what would your daily life be like? This is a question I ask the people of color. If you could simply give us feedback when we step in it, which we inevitably will, and have us receive that with grace, reflect, and seek to do something different, what would your daily life be like? And recently, a man of color in the room, there was a pause, and then he said, it would be revolutionary. And I just want you to sit with that for a minute. Revolutionary, that white people would receive the feedback, reflect, and try to change our behavior. That would be a revolution. Returning to the pillars underneath the dock, now we can label them, right? So we have individualism, we have universalism, right? Individualism, why can't we all be different? Universalism, why can't we all be the same? They both function to take race off the table. We have internalized superiority that no white person can miss. It was not lost on me that fundamentally it is better to be white. I don't want that belief. I didn't ask for that belief, and I've committed my life to challenging it, but 24/7, that is what society reinforces for me. So internalized superiority is also one of the pillars. The good-bad binary is a very foundational pillar of holding up new racism. And segregation, the power of segregation to keep this system in place. And for me, by identifying those pillars, it has helped guide me to then how would I challenge each of those things. And so I urge you to take this journey. It is lifelong. It won't be over in my lifetime. I will never be free of all of the investments in this system that I have that I can't see, but I have committed my life to doing my very best to continually challenge it. And I invite you, in fact, urge you to do the same.
Pretty well done, I think. I hope you all agree. I'm going to put up some questions the program suggests, but any initial thoughts or feedback, feel free to speak up if you care to. Oops, or maybe everyone is mute and I have to. Oops. but very well done. Or have most of you read her book or know much about her? Anybody? Is anyone? Are you hearing me? I feel like my sound may not be working.
Susan,
Yes.
Susan, Cecilia. Yeah, I'm hearing you fine.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for showing that. The first time I watched this video, I was just speechless.
Right, right.
And I have read her book. In fact, I have a copy of it. I can mail it to you and you can read it if you want to. I just want it back when you're done, but you can borrow it. I think it's one of the books that was pretty life-changing for me, but now that I'm seeing this video again, it's been quite a while since I've seen it, I'm reminded of how powerful it is. I mean, she covers a lot of territory. Mm-hmm. And I think the thing that hit me the hardest, well, there were several, but one of them when I first saw this video was that question of, there was nobody that taught me what I'm losing by being in this segregated life, this life that's chosen segregation. I mean, it was never said out loud, we're going to be a segregated neighborhood, church, school, community. But nobody ever even considered that I was losing something.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And that makes me really sad.
And I love her analogy of the pier. She uses that in several different talks I've seen her give. And it's very well done, and it's a very meaningful example, visual example. Absolutely, Celia. It was interesting. I appreciate your thoughts, Celia. I had kind of forgotten when I first watched it on YouTube.
That is?
Yeah.
White-haired woman. Cecilia.
Yes, go right ahead. I think Joanne was going to speak. Joanne, if you would like to speak, you're more than welcome to.
Very interesting.
Thank you. Thank you. I happened to come across some of the comments when I watched this on YouTube, and they were sort of astounding. And I will share them a couple. Yikes. Yikes. I mean, yikes is all I could come up with. The first few, her doctorate is in multicultural education. In other words, a made-up doctorate for a made-up major. This is actually scary. Listening to this pandering woman makes my skin crawl. As someone with, well, I think this one's kind of, who's mixed race, this makes me cringe. Racism is racism no matter how you frame it. And this is racism, this video. Again, we know people on the internet, no filters and whatnot, but the comments were really quite interesting. So it was fascinating. So there's questions that are listed here, and again, this is from the website, the Methodist website, Vital Conversations on Race, Culture, and Justice, and this is from Series 1, Racism in the U.S. Church. And I would be remiss if we didn't mention, and you probably already all know, we were perfectly set up for this discussion today by the sermon on Sunday by Reverend Nance. So if you haven't seen that, excellent as always. She does a terrific job, but very, very enlightening as always, but perfect for today's discussion. So any other thoughts that stood out to anyone else that they wanted to share? I was taken by watching it this time that it was like the second coming of Jesus to get white people to admit to whiteness being seen as inherently superior. It's really kind of something. How does she describe her experience as one who recognizes herself as a white person, especially when it comes to interacting with people of color? How do you think she recognizes herself as a white person? Anybody have anything they'd like to make mention of that? I think it's interesting that she starts out saying, just look at me, I'm white. Pretty enlightening.
Her whole background was white.
Absolutely.
Her whole background was white. She was raised by white parents. She went to white schools. She went to white churches. She went to a fancy white college that nobody else would probably be able to go to. She has a PhD, which not a lot of people have. So all of her whole life was white, 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 white. She may have come into contact just briefly with a Black person or a Muslim or somebody, but it makes a difference when that's all you've ever known.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I've shared, and I think probably you've all heard me say this. I mean, that's certainly my background, and perhaps several of you as well. I mean, I hadn't given race a thought. Honestly, I'm like, well, I'm not a racist. I mean, I don't have a problem with Black people. I would never say the N word. I'm a good person. I don't have a problem with any of that. And then several years back, I attended the Proctor Institute, which will very probably, unless I attend again, will be the only time I'm in a minority. I was one of a very few white people there, which was an astounding and completely eye-change opening experience. And it made me realize immediately I will never be the minority again, and enjoyed that feeling. But talking to somebody there one-on-one, they said, you know, we are confronted with racism every hour of every day, period.
Mhm.
She said, you've probably never thought about it before. Of course I haven't. Never thought about it. Never. Until that day when I'm in the minority and I can finally relate tiny bit what it might be like to be a Black person in our society. You know, we've got a long way to go, and it's this summer has really shown us a lot, some good, some bad. And it's interesting, as a stalker of Dr. D'Angelo, she now has gray hair. So I don't know if this summer has done her in, but it seems to have put some gray hair on her head. But so yeah, that's absolutely. But you're right, Verna. That's exactly, and that's certainly the background I have, and probably most of us as well.
Mhm.
And I think it speaks well for the Methodist Church to produce such wonderful video series. I mean, and the very first step, at the very least, is we're trying to learn and we're trying to educate ourselves and understand that we all have implicit bias. And that seems to me, again, as a non-expert, without question, that's the first step, is acknowledgement and trying to understand. Is that, would anybody have a thought about that? Her next question, these are great questions. They're very detailed questions they pose, but how does denying the existence of racism and white privilege perpetuate racial inequality? It's kind of mostly a society. We're like, no, we're all fine. We're good people. We're not racist. So how does denying that racism even is an issue these days?
I think that some people, what they don't, how do I want to say this? I have found that more people want to have given me pushback that they have white privilege.
Right. I think you're exactly right, Ann.
And that they're racist. I don't have white. I had to work for every single thing I have. I have no white privilege. I am not, you know.
Is that why people are so upset by that term, white privilege?
I guess it's the fear that they're going to lose something.
Perhaps.
I'm guessing. That's just where I've seen the most pushback is when I have said, you and I have white privilege. We have it. It's a fact. And people take offense to me telling them they have white privilege. I have white privilege.
Absolutely.
I don't just say you do. No, I do. I grew up with white parents and a white church and a white school. I did not go to school with a Black person until I was a junior in college. And, you know, TCU took a token Black kid.
Right. And your situation and experience is not that different from most of ours, I think, Ann. Absolutely. And one of her presentations, she talks a lot about education, the educational system. And I had never thought of it in this term, that she talks about our good school systems. People will move somewhere where there's a good school system. And she said, well, that means it's not a Black school. It's a white school. It's a good school system. And that, I think that's a pretty fair statement.
Well, historically, you know, our textbooks, as when I was a child, when we get new textbooks, the textbooks that we gave up went to the Black school.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's
Black schools did not look as nice and clean, even though, you know, they weren't as new. The new houses were being built out to get away from the city, which is where the Black people live, and all the new schools with all the leading edge technology that we laugh at now because that's so old school. But those were all, I remember white flight, that people literally moved to the suburbs, moved out of their homes to get away from Black kids in their school.
That's right. Absolutely. And it still
And
happens today.
And Jim and I are guilty of every time we moved, once we had children, even before, the most important thing to us was, how are the schools? We didn't ask it, but how many Black kids in your schools? But the good schools didn't have many Black kids. We just wanted to know, it was for resale value before we had children, but then it became a very real issue.
Yeah, that was very enlightening for her to couch it in good school, that term. And she talked about, she lives in Portland, and talking about she said, and I've heard her say on several of these videos, that white liberals are the most dangerous, I'm not sure I'm paraphrasing, are the biggest threat to racism these days, or perpetuating it. She said, because we all think, we white liberal folk, open-minded people, we're not, we're just not racist. We don't have white privilege. And again, you're exactly right. I think that's where a lot of it does lie. And we don't think about it. Or we're starting to think about it. Hopefully. But you're absolutely great thoughts, Anne. Thank you for sharing that.
Susan,
Yes, ma'am.
I think sometimes that word privilege now is such a kind of a trigger for people. One of my friends suggested using just the word white advantage and to ask us to think about, so how are we advantaged by our laws, by our institutions, by our traditions? What advantages do we have that a Black person doesn't have? Now, I don't know if that's just semantics, if it really would make a difference, I don't know. But I think the whole idea of white privilege is to try to get us to look at how is it that we benefit from the systems, of racism.
Celia, I think, all of us have a bank account. That's one of the things. I mean, it may be small, it may be big, but, most Black people, especially the poorest one, they don't have a bank account. They don't have any money if they're hungry to fall back on. If something disastrous happens, it just happens. And we don't think about that. That's a white privilege.
And that privilege
came with responsibility and work and saving, but still.
But it also came with what we inherited, in the sense, not necessarily that our parents gave us a lot of money when they died, but we inherited a whole history of decisions that got made because our families were white. I mean, I've said this before, and some of you may have heard it. I'm sorry to be repetitive, but I know that Mother and Daddy were able to, after Daddy came back from the war, they got married, and then when they moved to Knoxville, they lived over on Riggs Avenue in a little house that, little tiny house. And then they were able to borrow money because of an FHA loan, or, the things that white people could get, right? White people could get these loans, and then they built a house. I mean, those kinds of decisions and benefits that they had have made a difference in my life today in 2020. That's one of the benefits, one of the ways I have a privilege.
Celia, I love the white advantage.
I do too.
Privilege. I love it. You wonder if it's just a matter of semantics, but it's just not as in your face as the word privilege. If I still have trouble understanding why people get so upset, but if privilege is related to the fact that they feel like they've worked for their privilege, maybe advantage whitewashes that some. I don't know. But I like that.
What you're saying, it's not it's not equated with how hard you worked for it.
Mm-hmm.
When I graduated from college, I got my very first job, and I'd grown up in Dallas, Texas, went to school in Fort Worth. I got my very first job in Edinburgh, Texas, which is right on the border. Edinburgh and McAllen are the two towns that are right across from Reynosa. So I moved down there to work, and I was so excited. Bottom line is, it's more than 80, it's probably 90% Hispanic down there. But I don't remember feeling like you described, Susan, that maybe I can see what's happening. I felt like the different one, and quote unquote, from the pack in the room. And I wonder now how much of my white privilege kept me from seeing that I was not in the majority. I'm just ignorant. Now, I loved the people down there. They were lovely to me. It wasn't as much skin color, except, yeah, it really kind of was, because people's skin was more olive and their hair was black. And, you know, being a little Southern Baptist girl from Dallas, I was horrified that somebody named their child Jesus. And absolutely horrified until I realized, oh, okay. You know, it's very common. It's very common for Hispanics to do that.
Absolutely. Well, those are terrific comments, Anne. And I mean, you're right. It's certainly not just, it's anyone of color, obviously. And that definition of racism goes back to people of capital C color. And I probably, honestly, would never given it much of a second thought, but we're finally being in the minority one time in my life.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, those were extremely intelligent people who had played huge roles in the civil rights movement in the 60s. I mean, the people I was eating lunch and dinner with were friends with Martin Luther King. He was the best man at their wedding. He married these people. I mean, so these people were astounding. I mean, I was 12th class citizen compared to them, regardless of color of my skin. But I would never have had that feeling. I don't think I would get it. I don't think I'd get it if I hadn't had that experience myself. I'm very privileged, advantaged to have had that opportunity. I do love that term, white advantage.
Oddly enough, the only time I felt discriminated against was in Salt Lake City, Utah, in the 2.5 years Jim and I lived there, because we weren't Mormon.
I've heard other folks say that.
And the whole city, even though it was 50-50, but the Mormons ran the city, and everything happened to getting cable, to being able to order a drink in a restaurant, to everything hinged on what the Mormon church said had to hinge on.
Right.
Schools, you know, teachers couldn't give homework on Tuesday night because that was family home evening.
Right. You had to learn it.
Even in the public school.
Absolutely.
You know, and so it was, that's the only time that I felt discrimination was there, and it was because a pack of people ran the show.
Right. Thank you for those thoughts as well, Anne. I know I want to be mindful of our time. Any other thoughts or suggestions? The information on the General Board, General Council, General Commission, I keep calling them the wrong name. Their website's excellent, excellent questions. They're very detailed. I will kind of throw out a little bit of the last question they throw out that talks about, Dr. D'Angelo says, we are not operating in the spiritual realm when it comes to racial issues as a church. Is this true for Christians? What does that mean concerning racism and justice, both theologically and biblically? That's some tough stuff. And I mean, you know, we see plenty of very religious people saying quite the opposite of what this video says, and their thinking is right. Thank you, General Commission on, I can't get their name. I call them the wrong name, but they're amazing. Look up the website. Thank you, Pat. Or no, Celia. Sorry, Celia. Celia. Thank you, Celia. But you know, we could go into plenty of churches, plenty of United Methodist churches, who would disagree with everything said in this video. I think. Would you agree? Am I off base? Yeah. So we certainly got a long ways to go. And I appreciate, again, certainly this dialogue, and I know the various groups at our church and the Holston Conference sponsors are amazing. If you want to look at her website, Robin D'Angelo, she's got resources upon resources upon resources. She's got terrific.
Okay.
Amazing. So if you have an interest, be sure to check that out. And if you also have an interest, stalk her on YouTube videos, because there's some amazing, amazing talks she's given. Final thoughts, other thoughts. I don't want to.
Well,
there's obviously so much.
I wanted to tell you something. Please pray for Nancy Staub's daughter. She's the minister, and she has COVID-19.
Oh no.
And also has asthma and has pneumonia. So Nancy's very concerned about her. She's been so careful, and so she either got it at the pediatrician's office where she took her daughter, or she got it, being a minister to somebody. But she's very ill. She's not in the hospital, but I wanted you to know.
Where does she live? Do you know?
She lives here in Knoxville.
Yeah.
Her daughter goes to Webb, and she kept her home so that she wouldn't get COVID. And she's been doing her work virtually. So, it's pretty devastating for the family. Her husband's a lawyer.
Remind us what church.
She has a church in Lenore City. I'm not sure the name of it. It's a small Episcopal church. Or is she? Yeah.
I think you're right, Episcopal. Yes.
Yes.
Thank you for that information. I'm very sorry to hear that.
So prayers.
Mother, Verna?
Nancy
the mother's
Staub.
name.
Her name is Amy Morehouse.
Amy
She's a
Morehouse.
minister in an Episcopal church in Lenore City. So she spoke to United Methodist Women a couple of years ago. She's very intelligent, but Nancy's just beside herself.
Well, of course she is. Thank you for that. Thank you for sharing that, Verna. Other prayer concerns? Anybody else?
People on the Gulf Coast.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
We do have people we know that are right in the middle of it. And my son-in-law's brother and his family and my son-in-law's parents live in Milton, Florida, which is north of Pensacola. And
sometimes you wonder what else can happen this year.
Don't say that, Susan.
How much more we can take. I mean, knock on wood. Other thoughts? I want to make sure. Oh, Jana.
I do have one thought. I was going to mention this earlier. She mentioned sketchy neighborhood, and it immediately made me think of, so this would be 30-ish years ago. My in-laws lived up at Cherokee Bluff, which, oversees the city, kind of behind UT Hospital. And we live in Seymour. So we always, I've never been afraid to take the shortcut route from Cherokee Hills over through Vestal to Chapman Highway and home. And one of the most shocking things of my parenthood was, as we were going through Vestal one evening, Will, my son, who was about 4 at the time, said, "Mom, lock the door. We're in a bad neighborhood." And I never said that. That was my preferred route. And I locked my door. So it wasn't like I locked it wherever we were. So it wasn't like, it had anything to do with the neighborhood. But it made me realize how, I don't even know how children learn that. And of course it wasn't, especially back then, but even so now, it's not necessarily that he was observing the color of people's skin, because most of the people the route that we passed through, most of them were white. But it just, that sketchy neighborhood, I mean, even children pick up on that, whether it has to do with color or class.
Absolutely.
And
here,
brings up an opportunity for, like you said, education. I mean, how else do you respond? But you got to respond. Anyway.
that's very enlightening. That's very enlightening, Jana. Thank you for sharing that story.
How do we, this is all, every single one of us are on the same page on the screen.
How do we fix it, or how do we start changing it?
Where do we go? Where do we go from this page? Where do we go from here?
Yeah.
Well, we're at least making the first step of educating ourselves, and at least we understand the problem, which, I mean, I don't know what the percentage is, but potentially a majority of white folks wouldn't even see there's a problem.
That's true.
So at least we're starting. If anybody has, I mean, yeah, absolutely. That's the real question. She offers some thoughts in some of her longer videos, but you know, there, as we all know, there is no easy or one right answer. But it's a bit discouraging, but again, certainly in this summer, but progress is perhaps being made and discussions are happening. Do you all feel like it's going in the right direction with this more education and more discussion? Will anything better or change?
I fear it won't. I mean, I look at church and I struggle with how few people of color are part of our inner city church. I struggle with that. And thank goodness, until recently, I haven't really seen any in very many leadership positions. I understand that's changing this fall, and I'm excited about that. But we have some very capable people of color in our church that need to have leadership positions. But I'm very troubled by the fact that we're an inner city. I consider us an inner city church with so few people of color. It's troubling. What do I do? What do I do about that? I don't know. I can't invite any people of color because I don't know very many. I mean, I have befriended several recently, but they're one's a pastor, one's one of the most involved church women in. I mean, you know, what can I do about that? I don't know. It leaves me feeling with I just have an icky feeling about it because. So I'm educating myself. That's not enough for me. And I'm searching. I'll tell you, I'm searching for what to do about it.
Well, and look right here. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. One of them's a male. Well, you did say Jim Bales at one time.
It just had him on there. It was really me.
Okay, we're glad to have you, Diane.
But
We use the tablet last.
Absolutely.
But look how few of us are on this talk out of a UMW of how many women.
Yeah, that's what bothers me is like all you women, I know how you feel, I know, but how do we change those people who think they're not a problem? You know, they're not, it's not important to them.
Absolutely, Diane. And it's not a problem and it's not important, so therefore they're not going to participate in a discussion.
My
like this.
problem.
Perhaps.
Did Catherine get any pushback Sunday? I wondered if there would be any pushback.
I wondered that too, and I do
Well,
not.
I loved it. I sat there and I went between laughing and crying and cheering during her sermon. I just loved every single word, and I've listened to it 2 more times. But I just wondered if there had been any pushback.
Well, you know, there was. I mean, you just know there was. People, that's just how we are. But I have a feeling she was able to overcome anything bad.
Well, she has the weight of the global church behind her.
Mm.
She's not saying, she has the church behind her. There's nothing.
Absolutely.
She's strong in her convictions, but I just wondered how many people. I hope there were a whole lot of people that heard it that were very uncomfortable with it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. because that's a start. That's a start. You're right. That's a great point, Ann. But it was an excellent sermon. So anybody where we'd be wise to watch that sermon again very carefully. Well, again, I appreciate you all being here. Excellent conversation, excellent dialogue. When Ann, when you figure out the answer to your questions of how we fix this and how we go forward, Jana, please share that enlightenment with us. Before I have a closing prayer, and in fact, well, we have a unison prayer, which I'll put up on the screen. I want to make sure that everyone knows in October about Celia's book study, and I want to be sure, Finding Peace in an Anxious World. Excellent, excellent book, an even better teacher here. So make sure if you haven't checked out the messenger about that. And also get excited for our bake sale. That is a bake sale expert. When is that? It's the 22nd of November. I had it pulled up and now it's gone. And it will be a drive-through bake sale, and we are working on that. And so just be aware of that and more information on things to come.
There'll be a paste in the messenger starting the 29th of October that you can click on, and it'll show you all the stuff that's being sold and how much it costs and how many of them, like 4 pans of brownies by so-and-so, 4 pies by 4 coconut pies by Jana Davidson, and how each much, and you can click I'll take 2, and then the website will quickly go to just 2 left.
Wow.
Yeah, so we're excited about that. Ann and Jean Gallion and I are helping with that endeavor. So if anybody has any thoughts or comments about that or suggestions, don't hesitate to let us know.
And send me what you're going to bake to put in it, please. I got my spreadsheet ready to fill up.
Exactly. Any other thoughts or comments? Go ahead, sorry, Jana.
Celia's book study. I literally, when we hang up, I'm going to place the first order for books. So if you have not signed up, I don't know, text, I mean, like literally when I hang up, when I'm going to do that. So
thank you.
I see some on here who have not registered. If you're going to do it, say so right now, and then I'll get you a book.
I'm doing it, and I signed up, but I've got my book on Amazon.
Oh, I saw that. Okay.
And I could use a book, Jana. Please put me down.
Okay. Anybody else?
Jana, you need to order them right away because they're very slow.
Well, I've talked to them, and they've kind of got it, supposedly.
Oh, good.
They
good.
kind of.
I'm not telling you what to do.
No, I appreciate it. They know we're coming. I'll put it that way. We'll see if they come through.
That sounds
Okay,
great.
well, Susan, I'll get you one.
Thank you, Jana. And I will make mention and
register if you haven't.
Perfect. Exactly, I will do that. We thought since we have our expert in October taken care of in November, we do something similar to this. And like I say, this Vital Conversations, there's so many options, but I came across one on ageism, which I thought might be of an interesting topic to us. If that sounds terrible, let me know. If it sounds decent, let me know. If you have other thoughts, let me know. But we would be planning that for the third Wednesday at 1:30. So as I see, that would be November 18th at 1:30. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Susan. Good work.
Let me, we'll see if I can close. Let's see, here's our closing prayer. If I can share it. Whoa, you can't really read that. Maybe you can sort of read that. Maybe not.
Yes.
You can read it as much as you can.
Yes.
If you will join me, let us pray. Most High God,
You are just to
advocate for justice for the widow and the orphan.
Our contemporary
time, one form of oppression is against people of color. Let me find out how we get to the next. Come on.
Open our eyes to the impact racism has on the world.
Sorry, we're trying to go.
Widow.
That's not very helpful. I will, if you, oh, no, that is it. Okay, sorry guys. That's a terrible prayer that I'm interrupting here. Open our eyes to the impact racism has on the widowed and the orphan. The African-American woman brutalized by the police. The Mexican-American student being told derisively to go back to Mexico. Use us to face white privilege and dismantle racism. Let us also be mindful of the people on the Gulf looking to deal with a hurricane, as well as we keep in our prayers Amy Morehouse. These things we ask in your name. Amen. And sorry for that. I was trying to make it nice and large print that you could see, and that didn't really help us. So thank you guys. Appreciate it. Hope you have a great afternoon.
Thank
Thank
you.
Thanks for joining.
Everybody.
Um,
You.